The first apple blossom opened on a cold April morning in 1874, and Clara Whitmore pressed her fingers to the window glass and wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming, bone-deep realization that a man had moved an entire mountain of earth, one shovelful at a time, simply because she had once told him she missed the smell of apple pie. Clara had arrived in Coldwater Creek, Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1872, wedged between two leather trunks and a carpet bag on the back of a freight wagon, her dark hair pinned too tightly and her jaw set in that particular way her mother had always called stubborn. She was 22 years old, recently widowed after less than a year of marriage, and she had precisely $14, a cast-iron skillet, and a recipe book written in her grandmother's looping hand. The war had taken her husband, James, in its very last gasps, and grief had taken her mother 6 months after. And then there had been nothing left for Clara in Virginia except empty rooms and the smell of tobacco her father had smoked, before he, too, had gone into the ground. So she had packed everything she owned into those 2 trunks and written a letter to her only remaining relative, her father's older brother Harold, who had apparently made something of himself out west in the Colorado Territory. She had not expected Coldwater Creek to be quite so cold, quite so small, or quite so full of mud. The town sat in a wide valley between 2 ridges of the Rocky Mountains, and it had the particular chaotic energy of a settlement that had not yet decided whether it was going to survive or simply blow away in the next hard wind. There was a general store run by a man named Ptolemy Graves, who had a magnificent mustache and an unfortunate habit of overcharging for flour. There was a saloon called the Copper Kettle, which Clara found an oddly domestic name for a place where men went to lose their wages. There was a church with a leaning steeple, a blacksmith shop that smelled of iron and sweat, a small schoolhouse that doubled as the town hall on election days, and a scattering of homes and cabins that stretched out toward the tree line like fingers reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Her Uncle Harold ran the livery stable and was a gentle, round-faced man with kind eyes and enormous hands permanently stained black with the oils of horses and leather. He welcomed her with a bear hug that lifted her off the ground, fed her the best venison stew she had eaten in years, and told her plainly that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed, and that no one in Coldwater Creek would make her feel like a charity case. Clara had spent the first weeks learning the rhythms of the town. She learned that the best time to visit Ptolemy's general store was early Tuesday morning before he had a chance to revise his prices with whatever mood had taken him overnight. She learned that the school teacher, a thin young man named Mr. Aldrich, desperately needed help and had no shame about asking for it. She began teaching the younger children their letters on Monday and Wednesday afternoons, and in exchange the parents of those children paid her in whatever they had: smoked ham, jars of pickled beans, bolts of calico fabric, and once, memorably, a very confused live chicken. She learned to love the mountains. That had surprised her, having come from the soft rolling green of Virginia, where the hills were gentle suggestions rather than declarations. The Rockies were declarations. They were demands. They sat on the horizon at all times, white-capped and indifferent, and there were mornings when Clara stepped out of her uncle's house and looked up at them and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was pulled tight. But there were also things she missed with a sharpness that caught her off guard. She missed the ocean of green that Virginia turned in spring. She missed her mother's voice. She missed, more than almost anything, the apple trees that had grown behind her grandmother's house in the valley where she had spent her summers as a child, the way they bloomed in April, the way the whole hillside smelled like a promise, the way her grandmother would press warm apple pie into her hands in September and tell her that every good thing in the world could be found in the center of a well-made pie. There were no apple trees in Coldwater Creek. There were pine trees, magnificent and dark, climbing the mountain slopes in their millions. There were aspen stands that turned gold in autumn and took her breath away. There were willow trees along the creek itself and a few struggling cottonwoods in the lower pastures. But apple trees, bearing fruit, the kind that could be peeled and sliced and laid out with sugar and cinnamon in a waiting crust, those did not exist within 20 miles of Coldwater Creek, and the apples that arrived at Ptolemy's store were dried, shriveled, expensive things that bore only the ghost of a resemblance to what Clara had known. She had mentioned this once, in passing, to a small group of townswomen gathered at the church for a quilting afternoon. She had said, without thinking much about it, that she would give nearly anything for a fresh apple pie, that her grandmother's recipe was the best she had ever tasted, and that she had not made it properly in going on 3 years. The women had nodded sympathetically. One of them had suggested she try canned peaches, which was well-meaning but not at all the point. And then the subject had moved on, as subjects do, to the price of dry goods and the state of the schoolhouse roof. Clara had thought nothing more of it. She had at that time barely even spoken to Eli Vance. She had seen him, of course. It was impossible to be in Coldwater Creek and not have seen Eli Vance, because he was not a man who could be overlooked. He came down from the mountains about once a month, sometimes less often in the deep of winter, and when he came, he moved through the town like something from a different world entirely, which Clara supposed he was. He was enormous. That was the first word that came to mind, though it was not quite accurate enough. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that made door frames look like they had been built wrong, with arms that looked like they had been carved from the same rock as the mountains themselves. He had dark hair that fell past his collar, not untidy exactly, but uncut in the way of a man who did not think much about such things, and a dark beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of overcast sky before a storm, and they were watchful and calm in the way that very large, very confident men's eyes sometimes were. He wore buckskin most of the time, and a battered coat that had clearly been repaired many times, and he carried a rifle with the easy familiarity of a man who had been carrying one his entire life. He was a trapper and hunter by trade, and he lived alone in a cabin up past the tree line on the western ridge, and the men in the saloon said he had been there longer than almost anyone, that he had come west from somewhere in Tennessee as a young man and simply stayed, that he knew these mountains better than any man alive, that he had once fought off a grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife, and that he was the finest shot in the territory. Clara had learned all of this secondhand, as women in small towns learn most things about solitary men, through the slow accumulation of overheard conversations and offered opinions. She had spoken to him directly for the first time in November of 1872, barely 2 months after her arrival. She had been coming out of Ptolemy's general store with a sack of cornmeal over one shoulder and a jar of molasses in the crook of her arm, and she had been moving too fast and not watching the uneven boards of the porch steps, and her boot had caught and she had gone down. The cornmeal had gone one way, the molasses another, and she had landed hard on her palms and one knee in the muddy street. Before she had time to properly register the embarrassment, a very large hand had appeared in her field of vision. She had looked up. Eli Vance had been standing over her, and she had understood in that moment why the women of the town sometimes got a slightly unfocused look when they discussed him. Up close, he was even more striking. The gray eyes focused on her with a quiet concern that had nothing performative about it, the big hand extended with a straightforward practicality that made refusal seem absurd. "You all right?" he had said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the remnants of a southern accent smoothed almost flat by years of solitude. "I am fine," Clara had said, though her palms were bleeding a little, and she had taken his hand, and he had pulled her upright with an ease that suggested she weighed approximately nothing. He had retrieved the cornmeal sack and the molasses jar without comment, handed them back to her, checked that the jar had not cracked, and said, "Watch the third board on the left. It rocks." And then he had walked away. It was not a romantic beginning, but Clara had found herself thinking about those few words, the steadiness of them, the lack of performance, the simple and direct attention, on and off for the rest of that day. She saw him again at the church Christmas gathering that December, standing at the edge of the room with a cup of cider and an expression of polite tolerance that suggested he was there out of duty rather than pleasure. She had been playing the piano, which she did adequately if not brilliantly, and when she had finished and looked up, he had been watching her, and he had given her a single nod that felt, somehow, like an entire conversation. They had spoken properly for the first time in January, when a late blizzard had trapped most of the town indoors for 4 days, and the general store had become a kind of informal gathering place for anyone with enough cabin fever to brave the walk. Clara had been there with her Uncle Harold, and Eli had come in for supplies, and through some arrangement of the small space and the assembled townspeople, they had ended up at the same end of the counter, while Ptolemy's boy filled their orders. "You are the one teaching the children," Eli had said. It was not a question. "I am," Clara had said, "and you are the one from the Western Ridge." Something that might have been amusement had moved across his face. "I am. I am told you know these mountains better than any man alive. Whoever told you that was being generous." "I doubt that," Clara had said, and he had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, and then had very nearly smiled. They had talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential: the depth of the snow, the health of Harold's horses, the particular quality of the cold that year. And when his order was ready, and he had shouldered his supplies and touched the brim of his hat in farewell, Clara had felt the cold air of the open door differently than she had before. Spring came slowly to Coldwater Creek. The snow retreated up the mountain slopes in grudging inches through March, and the creek ran high and loud with meltwater, and the meadows below the tree line went from white to a pale, tentative green. Clara's teaching had expanded by then. She had taken on the older children for arithmetic and reading in the mornings, and she had also begun, at the particular urging of several women in the town, to offer a kind of informal class on household skills, not because she believed women needed such instruction, but because it gave them all an excuse to gather on Thursday afternoons and talk, which she suspected was the actual point. It was at one of these Thursday afternoons, in late March of 1873, that she had said the thing about the apple pie. She had been showing young Marie Dupin, the blacksmith's eldest daughter, how to make a proper pastry crust, and the conversation had wandered naturally to the different pies each woman in the room knew best, and Clara had described her grandmother's apple pie in such detail: the particular ratio of sugar to cinnamon, the way the apples needed to be thinly sliced and slightly undercooked so that they held their shape, the egg-washed crust with coarse sugar pressed into it, that several women had closed their eyes as though they could taste it. "I would make it every week if I could get decent apples," she had said. "I have not made it properly since Virginia." That was all. The conversation had moved on. She had not noticed that Eli Vance was in the adjoining room at the time, sitting with her Uncle Harold over a land matter, and that the door between the rooms was not quite closed. She would not learn that he had heard her for a very long time. Through the spring and summer of 1873, Clara and Eli Vance continued to build something that neither of them had a name for yet, in the slow, deliberate way of two careful people who have both been hurt before and are not inclined to rush. He came to town more frequently than he used to, every 2 weeks, then sometimes every 10 days. He had a habit of appearing when she needed something moved or fixed or carried, not intrusively, but with the calm, practical timing of a man who paid attention. He had helped her uncle strengthen the livery stable's east wall before the summer storms. He had carried her heavy teaching materials up to the schoolhouse when she had arrived to find the door locked and Mr. Aldrich absent with a fever. He had shot the rattlesnake that had been living under the porch steps of Harold's house and dispatched it without drama or visible distress, and had then, at her specific request, told her precisely how far out from a building you needed to check before stepping out in the mornings. He was not a man who spoke freely. She understood that about him early. He was not quiet from lack of intelligence or lack of feeling, but from a preference for economy. He did not say things unless he meant them, which meant that the things he did say had a weight and precision that Clara found she craved in the same way she craved good bread when she had been eating poor. She, in turn, was not shy. She talked easily, laughed readily, had opinions about everything from the territorial legislature to the best way to smoke venison, and was not remotely intimidated by silence or sighs. She had once made her Uncle Harold laugh until he cried by delivering a 20-minute monologue on the failings of the U.S. mail system to a horse who had been visibly unimpressed throughout. She talked to Eli in the same straightforward way she talked to everyone, and she thought sometimes that this was part of what kept drawing him back, that she did not treat him like a legend or a curiosity, did not perform any version of herself for him, was simply and entirely Clara. In July, he had taken her riding up past the tree line on a morning when the air was sharp and clear as cut glass, and the mountains had been wearing clouds around their peaks like crowns. He had a second horse, a calm roan mare named Patience, which he had said she was welcome to use whenever she wanted. The valley had spread out below them like a quilt, and the creek had glittered like a dropped ribbon, and Clara had sat on Patience's back and breathed the air and felt something so close to happy that it had frightened her a little. "It is extraordinary," she had said. "Yes," Eli had said. He had been looking at her, not the valley, and when she had turned to find him watching, he had looked away without embarrassment, calm as stone. She had let that sit without comment, but she had taken it with her when she rode back down into town, turning it over in her mind. By August, they were having long conversations on Harold's porch in the evenings, and Clara had begun to understand the fuller shape of who Eli Vance was. He had grown up in the Cumberland Mountains of Tennessee, the second son of a farmer, and had come west in 1859 when he was 20 years old, drawn by the same restless pull that had drawn so many men in that era, the sense that the continent had more room in it than the life being offered to him. He had never married. He had come close once, he said, with a flatness in his voice that told her not to press, and she had not. He had been trapping and hunting these mountains for 14 years. He knew which passes were safe in November and which would kill you. He knew where the elk wintered, and where the bears denned, and which streams ran clear in a dry August, and which went to mud. He had built his cabin himself, had cut every log and chinked every gap, had made his own furniture from the timber of the ridge. He grew a kitchen garden each summer and kept a small larder that could sustain him through the hardest winters. He was 40 years old to her 23, and she was aware that some in the town had noticed the 17-year age difference, and she was aware that she did not particularly care, because age was not the thing. The thing was how he listened when she spoke, and how he spoke when he listened, and how the world felt more solid and more interesting when he was in it. In September of 1873, he had kissed her. It had happened on Harold's porch, on an evening when the aspens on the slopes above the town had been burning gold and orange, and she had been telling him something funny that had happened in school that day, and he had been watching her with that expression she had come to know, that deep, focused attention, and she had trailed off mid-sentence because of it, and then there had been no more words between them for a good while. He was not a clumsy man. He was careful and certain and warm, and Clara had thought, when she finally stepped back and looked at him, that she had never in her life felt so particular, so specifically seen, as she did under the weight of his attention. "I should tell you something," he had said. "You can tell me anything," Clara had said. He had shaken his head. "Not yet. I need to do something first." She had found this mysterious and slightly maddening, but Eli Vance was not a man to be rushed, and she had learned by then that patience with him was always rewarded. She had not known what he was doing for almost a year. In the autumn of 1873, after their first kiss, Eli Vance had ridden down from his mountain and gone to see Ptolemy Graves. He had asked Ptolemy, who received supply shipments from Denver and occasionally from further east, whether it was possible to order apple tree saplings. Ptolemy had scratched his magnificent mustache and said he thought it could be arranged, but it would take time and it would cost something. Eli had said he wanted as many as could be safely transported and had laid a sum of money on the counter that made Ptolemy's eyebrows rise to his hairline. He had also ridden 2 days south to a settlement called Ridgeway, where he had heard there was a man who had some experience with growing fruit trees at elevation. That man, a quiet German immigrant named Klaus Brauer, who had come west with dreams of planting an orchard, had been living in Ridgeway for 8 years and had learned through painful trial and error which apple varieties could survive the altitude and cold of the Colorado Rockies and which could not. He had told Eli about the Roxbury russet, which was old and hardy and could handle cold snaps better than most. He had told him about the Black Oxford and the Newtown Pippin, and about site selection, south-facing slopes with good drainage, protected from the worst north winds in the particular zone between the creek bottom frosts and the high mountain cold. He had talked for 4 hours and drawn diagrams in the dirt, and Eli had listened to all of it with the same focused attention he gave everything, asking precise questions and committing the answers to memory. He had ridden back to Coldwater Creek and ridden further up to his ridge and stood for a long time in the meadow below his cabin, looking at the land with new eyes. There was a south-facing slope below his cabin, sheltered on 3 sides by the ridge, and a stand of old pines that caught sun from mid-morning until late afternoon. The soil there was rich. He had always grown his kitchen garden in the lower corner of it. The drainage was good. The elevation was manageable. Klaus had said that with enough preparation, enough organic matter worked into the soil, and the right varieties, it was not impossible. Not impossible was enough for Eli Vance. He had begun that October. He was alone in the undertaking, which meant he was not rushing. He started by clearing the slope, not of all vegetation, because Klaus had told him that leaving windbreak trees on the north edge was important, but of the scrub brush and competing growth across the main planting area. He worked from first light until last, day after day, cutting and pulling and stacking brush into burn piles that he let dry through October before setting them alight on calm evenings when the smoke rose straight up into the darkening sky. The burning left ash, and he worked the ash into the upper layer of soil, which was rocky in places and needed amendment. He carted compost from his kitchen garden. He hauled decomposed leaf matter from the aspen grove. He broke up the hardpan layer in the planting locations with a mattock that raised blisters on his hands, even through the thick calluses he had built up over decades of hard work. He dug the planting holes in November before the ground froze completely. 24 holes in 4 rows of 6, spacing them as Klaus had instructed, and he shaped the ground around each one into a slight dish to direct water toward the roots. He marked each location with a stake so that in spring he would know exactly where to plant. The saplings arrived in early April of 1874, wrapped in damp burlap and packed in a wooden crate that had come by wagon from Denver. There were 26 of them, 2 extras in case of loss, in a variety of the 3 species Klaus had recommended. Ptolemy had sent word up to the ridge, and Eli had come down and loaded them onto his pack horse with the same care he might have given to something fragile and alive, which they were. He planted every one of them himself, over 6 days, working from before sunrise to after dark, on his knees in the turned earth with his big hands working more gently than a man his size seemed to have any right to. He staked each young tree against the spring winds. He laid cut brush and straw around each base to hold moisture and protect the roots. He hauled water from the creek upslope in buckets until his shoulders ached with it. It was the most sustained effort he had made toward anything other than his own survival in his 41 years of life. He told no one what he was doing, not Harold, not Ptolemy, not Clara. Clara, during this period, was falling in love with him in the ordinary daily way that love actually happens, not in the single dramatic moment of a story, but in the accumulation of small things. She was falling in love with the way he took his coffee, plain and dark, and the way he looked at the mountains in the early morning like they were old friends he was checking in on. She was falling in love with how gentle he was with Harold's horses, and how impatient he was with men who treated horses badly, and with the fact that he had read more books than anyone she had met in Coldwater Creek, carrying them up and down the mountain in his pack because he said winter was long and a bad book was a waste of winter. She was falling in love with the way he laughed, which was rare enough to be worth waiting for, a low, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. She was falling in love with his hands, which were the most capable hands she had ever seen, and with the scar on his left jaw that he had gotten, he told her, from a fall when he was 11 years old, and with the way he said her name, Clara, as if it were a word he had chosen carefully. She had also begun to suspect, through the spring months of 1874, that he was spending an unusual amount of time on his ridge doing something he was not telling her about. He came to town with the same regularity he had established through the previous year, but sometimes he came looking worn in a way that spoke of sustained physical labor. His hands more roughened than usual, a tension through his shoulders that she recognized as the residue of hard work. When she asked him what he was doing, he told her he was working on the property, which was true enough, and she let it go. Then came the April morning when he had brought her up to the ridge. He had asked her to come up and see his cabin, which he had never shown her before, and she had known that this was significant, that inviting her up was itself a kind of declaration. She had ridden Patience up the mountain trail behind him, through the fragrant pine forest, and out into the open meadows of the high slopes, where the air was clean and cold and sharp even in April, and she had seen his cabin for the first time and loved it immediately. It was well made, solid and low against the hillside, with a covered porch that looked out over the valley below, and a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a thin blue line. Inside it was simple and functional, but it had the quality of a place that had been lived in with intention. Books in stacked rows, a work table with tools arranged precisely, a fireplace with good stones, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a braided rug on the floor that he admitted, with the barest trace of self-consciousness, he had made himself one winter when he had run out of other things to do. She had been looking at the braided rug and thinking about a man who was large enough to have trouble with door frames sitting alone on a winter evening, methodically braiding a rug, when he had said, "Come outside. I want to show you something." He had taken her around the east side of the cabin, down a gentle slope to where the south-facing meadow opened below them, and she had seen the orchard. 26 young apple trees standing in their 4 rows, not yet in full leaf, some of them with the first pale blush of blossom just opening. They were small, as young trees are small, but they were alive and they were obviously tended, the turned earth around each one dark and moist, the stakes straight, the whole arrangement neat and purposeful against the backdrop of mountain and sky. Clara had stood there for a very long time without speaking. "Apple trees," she had finally said, because she needed to say something. "Roxbury russet, black Oxford, and Newtown pippin," Eli had said from behind her. "They do well at altitude. I had advice. You planted these." "Over the past 6 months, started clearing in October." She had turned to look at him. He was standing a few feet back as he often did, giving her room, watching her with that gray-eyed attention, and she could see, now that she was looking for it, a particular tension in his stillness. He was not as calm as he appeared. He was waiting. "You planted an entire orchard," Clara said, "alone. It is not so large as all that." "Eli." "I heard you," he said simply. "Last March, at Harold's, when you were talking about your grandmother's pie. The door was not closed, and I heard you say you would make it every week if you could get the apples. And I thought—" He stopped. He looked at the trees, then back at her. "I wanted you to have that. I wanted you to have the thing you missed." Clara felt the tears come before she had decided to cry, which was unlike her. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was mildly annoyed at herself for it. And that particular combination, emotion and mild annoyance at the emotion, was so thoroughly her that he recognized it, and the corner of his mouth moved. "You are going to tell me this was unnecessary," he said. "It was absolutely unnecessary," Clara said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "It was the most unnecessary thing anyone has ever done for me." She crossed the distance between them in a few quick steps, and he caught her in those big arms with the ease of a man who had been waiting for exactly that, and she pressed her face into his chest and let herself feel the full weight of what had been given to her. Not just the orchard, not just the labor of it, but the listening, the remembering, the year of silent, solitary work undertaken entirely on her behalf. She pressed her fingers to the window glass, later, standing in his cabin while he built up the fire, and looked out at the pale blossoms moving in the April wind, and wept a little more for reasons she could not entirely have named, for her grandmother, perhaps, and for the apple trees behind her grandmother's house, and for the terrible length of her grief before this, and for the extraordinary unreasonable goodness of this moment. "I should tell you something," Eli said from behind her. He was the one who had said that before, that September night on Harold's porch. She turned from the window. He was standing by the fire, not performing anything, just standing there with that straight, honest way he had, and he said, "I love you, Clara. I have for a long time, and I would like to ask you to marry me, but I wanted to be sure first that you had a reason to stay, not just me, a life up here, a real life with things that matter to you." "You thought I needed apple trees to have a reason to stay," Clara said. "I thought you needed home," he said. "And home is not just a person. It is the smell of what you love, and the sound of the things that matter, and the food that takes you back to the people who first showed you how to love anything. Your grandmother's recipe, the apple trees, the pie, that is part of who you are, and I wanted you to have it." Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the dark eyes, serious above the close-trimmed beard, the enormous shoulders, the big, careful hands, the man who had given her a year of labor as a gift because he had heard her say she missed something. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you. And I want to live right here, in this cabin, on this ridge with those apple trees, and I want it very much." He let out a breath, and she realized only then, from the size of that exhale, how much he had been holding. They were married in June of 1874 in the leaning steepled church of Coldwater Creek, with Harold Whitmore giving Clara away and half the town in attendance, and Ptolemy Graves, who had an unexpectedly fine tenor voice, singing a hymn that made old Mrs. Hannity in the front row produce her handkerchief. Clara wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had sewn herself over the preceding months, and she had woven meadow flowers into her dark hair, and every person who saw her that morning agreed afterward that she had never looked more herself, not dressed up, not transformed, but simply Clara at her most fully realized, which was better than transformation. Eli wore a jacket Clara had not seen before, dark wool, clearly bought for the occasion, which made her feel a sudden rush of tenderness so acute it was nearly unbearable. He was shaved close for once, and his dark hair was tied back, and he was so large and so straight and so unmistakably, uncomplicatedly himself at the front of that little church that she had walked the whole length of the aisle with her eyes on his face. The Reverend, a stout and cheerful man named Collins, who had come to the territory from Ohio and still sometimes seemed faintly astonished by everything he encountered, pronounced them husband and wife with evident delight, and Eli had kissed her with a thoroughness that made the assembled Coldwater Creek population produce a satisfying variety of responses ranging from happy tears to appreciative hoots from the men in the back row. They rode back up to the ridge that same evening, the summer air warm and soft around them, the valley below fading into blue dusk as they climbed. Clara had a carpet bag tied to Patience's saddle and her grandmother's recipe book in her coat pocket, and she felt the strangeness and rightness of it together, moving upward toward something new, carrying the most essential things. The first summer of their marriage was one Clara would remember for the rest of her life as having a particular quality of light, mountain summer light, clear and long, the kind that comes from high elevation and clean air and made every color more saturated than it had any right to be. She settled into the cabin with the quiet efficiency that was her nature, not transforming it, but extending it, adding small things that made it more lived in, shifting the furniture arrangements until they worked better, hanging curtains she had sewn from the calico bolts she had been given as teaching payment, arranging her grandmother's recipe book on the shelf beside Eli's books. She continued her teaching on the days she came down into town, riding Patience down the mountain trail in the mornings and back up in the evenings, and Eli always met her at the trail's top with the horses unsaddled and supper started, and these returns, the last light on the peaks, the smell of whatever he had cooking, his figure at the porch rail growing larger as she climbed, became one of the fixed points of her happiness. He taught her things about the mountains that winter. He taught her how to read the weather by the clouds and by the behavior of the animals, how to move quietly in deep snow, how to identify plants that were useful and those that were dangerous. He was a patient teacher, which she found slightly amusing given his usual economy of speech. But he understood that teaching was different from ordinary conversation. It required a kind of generosity she could see him consciously extend. She taught him things too. She taught him her grandmother's recipes, which he followed with the careful precision of a man accustomed to following instructions for things with consequences. The results were variable at first, but he was not a man who gave up on things, and by midwinter he could make a creditable cornbread and a venison stew that she told him honestly was better than hers. The apple trees survived their first winter, which was not guaranteed. 2 of the 26 did not make it. Eli had told her to expect some losses and had not appeared distressed by this, which he took as evidence of the measured long-term thinking that she had come to recognize as one of the essential qualities of who he was. The remaining 24 came back in the second spring, 1875, with more vigor than the first year, the way young trees establish themselves once their roots have found purchase, and by late May the blossoms were dense enough that the whole lower slope below the cabin smelled sweetly of apple flower on warm afternoons. Clara would carry her mending out to the porch and sit with it, and breathe the air and think about her grandmother, and most of the time she thought of her with joy rather than grief, which felt like a kind of healing she had not known she was still doing. The trees did not bear fruit that second year, which was expected. Young apple trees take several years to begin producing, and Klaus Brauer had told Eli as much. Clara had known this going in, and she was not impatient. She tended the trees herself during the growing season with the attentiveness of a woman who had been given something precious and was not going to take the giving of it lightly. She weeded around their bases and checked the stakes in the wind, learned to identify the early signs of insect damage and what to do about them, and talked to Eli over supper about each tree's progress with a specificity that made him look at her with the expression she loved most, that deep private warmth that surfaced when she was most herself. Through the summer of 1875, life in Coldwater Creek was not entirely peaceful. The territory was in the complicated state that most of the American West was in during that period, caught between the world being built and the world being destroyed in the building. The northern Ute people, whose land this had been for generations, had been pushed further and further by the waves of settlers and miners moving through and into the mountains, and there was a tension in the territory that expressed itself in different ways in different places. In Coldwater Creek, it was mostly a background presence, a knowledge that the peace of the valley was fragile and built on foundations that Clara, who was an honest woman, thought about more than she spoke of. She had come to know a Ute man named Tava, who traded occasionally in Coldwater Creek, a quiet and dignified elder with a calm way of looking at things that reminded her, in some ways, of Eli. Eli treated him with the directness and respect he gave to everyone who had earned it, and the two men had an understanding that went back years, built on the shared knowledge of these specific mountains. It was from Tava that Eli had first learned some of the mountain's finer details, which trails were reliable, where the water ran sweet, which slopes held snow longest. He acknowledged this debt freely and without performance, which Clara thought said something essential about his character. The treaty negotiations of that era were a distant drumbeat, and the news that came up from Denver through the summer of 1875 spoke of land pressures and government actions that Clara found troubling. She talked about it with Eli, who listened and agreed with her assessments, and she wrote letters to a newspaper in Denver expressing her opinions on the matter clearly and at some length, because she was not a woman who thought that having opinions was sufficient if you did not also try to make them audible. She was not sure the letters accomplished anything, but she wrote them. In the autumn of 1875, Clara discovered she was expecting a child. She had suspected it for some weeks before she was certain, and when she was certain she had sat in the cabin alone for an hour, which she had not intended to do, simply sitting with the knowledge of it and letting it settle through her. She had thought about James, her first husband, briefly, and with the particular tenderness she could sometimes now achieve for that short chapter of her life. He had been a good man, and she had not had the chance to know him as well as she would have liked. She had thought about her mother and her grandmother. She had thought about this cabin and this ridge, and the man who had built a whole orchard on the strength of an overheard sentence. She told Eli that evening, after supper, while he was reading at the table and she was sewing, and she had said it plainly because she was not a woman who built to revelations. "I'm expecting a child," she had said, "in the spring, I think." He had looked up from the book, and she had watched the information move through him, through those gray eyes, through the stillness of his face. Then he had put the book down very carefully, stood up from the table, crossed to where she was sitting, and knelt down in front of her, which brought his face level with hers and made the size of him somehow different, not smaller, but more vulnerable. He had taken her hands and he had said quietly, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she had said. "And you are?" He stopped, searching for the word. "Happy," she told him. "I am very happy." He had pressed his forehead against her hands then, and she had felt him breathe, once, deeply, and when he looked up, his expression was so unguarded that she had thought she was seeing something he had never shown anyone else. "I'm going to be here for everything," he said. "You will not go through any part of it without me." "I know," she had said. "I have never doubted that." The pregnancy proceeded well through the winter of 1875 into 1876. Clara was healthy and functional and deeply annoyed by anyone who suggested she ought to be more delicate, including the town doctor, Dr. Marsh, who had a slightly patronizing manner that she had always found bracing. She continued teaching through February, riding down the mountain only twice a week as her energy dictated, and she reorganized the cabin's storage and layout with the purposeful intensity of a woman who was nesting and knew it and did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. Eli was, as he had promised, present through everything. He modified the cabin in small practical ways, built a cradle from the smooth-grained aspen he had been saving for some other project, fitted the bedroom with additional shelving, stocked the larder with more depth than usual. He rode down to Denver in January, in the hard cold, and came back with specific things Clara had written on a list, including several items she had not expected him to find, including a particular shade of soft flannel she had described from memory, and a book on infant care that she had not actually asked for, but that made her set down everything she was holding when she opened it. "Where did you find this?" she said. "Bookseller on Larimer Street," Eli said, hanging up his coat. He had to look for it. Took most of a day. "You spent a day looking for this. It seemed important. You seem like someone who prefers to know things." Clara had looked at him over the top of the book, this man who had ridden to Denver in January, cold to find a book because she seemed like someone who preferred to know things, and felt so thoroughly loved that she had simply stood there for a moment and let herself feel it. The baby came in March of 1876, on a cold, bright day when the snow was still heavy on the ridge, and the apple trees below the cabin were bare and dark against the white. Clara had labored through the night with the town midwife, Mrs. Torres, who had made the climb up the mountain trail in the dark with a lantern and her bag, and the cheerful competence of a woman who had brought a very large number of people into the world and did not plan to stop. Eli had been in the room because Clara had wanted him there, and had communicated this to Mrs. Torres with a clarity that left no room for the customary objections, and he had sat at her side through all of it with a steadiness that Clara had clung to during the worst of it. The baby was a boy. He came into the world with a startling degree of vocal confidence, and he was placed in Clara's arms in the gray March light, and she had looked down at this small, astonishing person and felt a love so immediate and total that it was like being struck. "Hello," she had said to him softly. Eli had looked at the baby for a long time without speaking, and then he had reached out one big finger, and the baby had wrapped his tiny hand around it with that blind, instinctive grip that new babies have, and Clara had watched something happen in Eli's face that she had never seen before, a kind of cracking open, a tenderness so extreme it was close to pain. "What is his name?" Eli had said very quietly. Clara had thought about it for months. "I thought Thomas," she said, "for your father." Eli had told her his father's name in one of their long autumn conversations on Harold's porch, and she had kept it. Eli had been quiet for a moment. "Thomas," he said. He seemed to try it out. "Thomas Vance. Is that all right?" He had looked at her then, and the expression on his face was so full that he could not apparently find any words for it, which was the most articulate answer he could have given her. They named the baby Thomas Harold Vance, Thomas for Eli's father, and Harold for Clara's uncle, who had burst into tears at the honor and then been embarrassed about the tears for roughly 30 seconds before giving up on the embarrassment and simply letting himself cry in the excellent way of a man who has reached the age where he knows that tears are not the enemy. The spring of 1876 was tender and rich. Clara moved through her days with a new quality of attention, the way that new parenthood sharpens the edges of things, makes you look at the ordinary world as if through the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time, because you are in the constant company of someone who is seeing it for the first time. Thomas was a good baby, calm and interested, with Eli's gray eyes already establishing themselves in his small face, and Clara's dark coloring, a combination that made Harold Whitmore declare him the finest-looking child he had ever seen, which he would declare about him continuously for the rest of the old man's life. Eli, with the baby, was one of the abiding wonders of Clara's life. He held Thomas with the same careful, certain competence he brought to everything physical, but with a gentleness that still surprised her sometimes, coming from a man of his size and experience. He would walk the baby in the evenings when Thomas was restless, pacing the porch in long strides with the baby against his chest, talking to him in a low, continuous murmur that Clara, listening from inside, thought was the most purely domestic sound she had ever heard. He taught Thomas things from the beginning, even when Thomas was too young to understand them. He talked to him about the mountains and the seasons and the names of the birds that came to the cabin. He held him up at the window to watch the snow fall. He took him, when Thomas was old enough to be carried safely, down to the orchard rows and walked between the young trees, describing each variety with a thoroughness that had more to do with the teaching than the tree. The apple trees bore their first fruit in the autumn of 1876, not abundantly, as young trees do not, but enough. Eli had come up from the orchard one September afternoon, carrying perhaps 24 apples in his jacket, cupped against his stomach, and had set them on the kitchen table with an expression of such quiet triumph that Clara had laughed and kissed him. She made the pie that evening. She had made her grandmother's recipe enough times from memory that she did not need the book, and she made it the way she always had, the crust mixed cold and handled lightly, the apples sliced thin and laid in overlapping layers, the sugar and cinnamon measured precisely, the top crust pressed and crimped and washed with egg and scattered with coarse sugar. She put it in the cast-iron Dutch oven over the fire and managed the heat with the careful attention of a woman who had been doing this since childhood. The smell of it filled the cabin and spilled out through the door and over the porch and down the slope into the evening air, and Clara stood in her kitchen on her mountain in Colorado territory in 1876 and smelled apple pie baking and felt her grandmother with her so strongly that she spoke to her quietly under her breath. Eli came in from the porch where he had been sitting with Thomas and stood in the doorway for a moment, breathing the smell of it, and something in his expression told Clara that this moment, this smell, this particular confluence of everything they had built, was what he had been imagining in those long months of solitary work on the slope below the cabin. The cleared brush, the turned earth, the careful holes, the staked saplings, the hauled water, all of it for this smell, in this kitchen, in this life. She cut the pie at the table, with Thomas in his cradle nearby, making the small, contented sounds of a baby who has eaten recently and feels fine about the world, and she gave Eli the first piece and watched his face while he tasted it. He chewed thoughtfully. He looked at her. "Your grandmother knew what she was doing," he said. "She did," Clara said. "She absolutely did." They ate the whole pie between them, which was not something Clara had planned to do, but the pie was very good, and the evening was long and warm, and Thomas slept, and there was no good reason to stop. The orchard grew. Year by year, as the apple trees established their roots and spread their canopy, the yield increased, slowly at first, and then with the generous abundance that healthy, mature trees eventually produce. By 1878, Clara was making apple pies for herself and for the neighbors who climbed the ridge to visit, and by 1879 she had more apples than the two of them and Thomas could possibly use, and she began bringing them down to Coldwater Creek on Patience's back in saddlebags and baskets. The town received them with something close to reverence. Fresh apples at this altitude in Colorado in the 1870s were not nothing. Ptolemy Graves bought a portion of each harvest at a fair price. Clara had long since stopped letting him set prices unilaterally and sold them in the store. The women of the town's Thursday gathering, still going strong, made apple pies and apple butter and dried apple slices and apple cake, and there was a general agreement that the Vance orchard on the western ridge was one of the better things that had happened to Coldwater Creek. Clara's grandmother's pie became something the town knew. She made it for church gatherings and harvest suppers, and the recipe circulated through a half-dozen households in the way that good recipes do, going by copying and memory and slight modification from kitchen to kitchen until it was woven into the town's idea of itself. Years later, old Mrs. Hannity would tell newcomers to the valley that there was a way to make apple pie that had come down from the mountain, and she would say it with the gravity of a woman speaking of tradition, and she was not wrong. In the spring of 1879, Clara discovered she was expecting their second child. Thomas was 3 years old by then, a strong-legged, serious boy who had his father's quiet attentiveness and his mother's willingness to form opinions about things, and who had spent most of his short life either riding around the mountain on Patience's back with his mother or following Eli through the orchard and the woods with the focused absorption of a child learning how the world works. He was already identifying bird calls with some accuracy and could name every apple tree in the orchard individually, which he had begun doing of his own accord, assigning each one a name he had invented himself, which Clara found both charming and slightly concerning about the future of his social life. The second pregnancy was similar to the first, healthy and active and managed by Clara with the same practical determination. She was 29 now, settled thoroughly into this life, the high ridge and the cabin and the orchard and the mountain town below. And she moved through her days with a groundedness she had never had in Virginia, a sense of being correctly placed in the world. Eli was 46. The years had not diminished him. If anything, the long life in the mountains had made him more himself, more solid, the way good wood seasons into something denser and finer than what it started as. He was a little more deliberate in his movement, more careful on the steep trails than he had been in his 30s, and his dark hair was threaded with gray at the temples, which Clara found unreasonably attractive and told him so. He had laughed at that, the genuine surprise laugh she loved, and said she was being kind, and she had told him she had never in her life been kind about something she did not mean. The second baby was born in November of 1879, a girl this time, and they named her Ruth Eleanor Vance. Ruth, because Clara had always loved the name, and Eleanor for Eli's mother, who had died when he was young and whom he spoke of rarely, but with a particular gentleness that told Clara she had been someone worth remembering. Ruth was different from Thomas from her first hours, louder, more physically aggressive, with an expression of constant determination that made the midwife Mrs. Torres say, approvingly, that this one knew what she wanted. She had Clara's dark hair and, as far as anyone could tell in the early weeks, Eli's square jaw, and she nursed with an intensity that Clara described to Harold as resembling a determined mining operation. Thomas's reaction to his sister had progressed through several phases: initial alarm, cautious assessment, and a gradually increasing proprietorial affection that eventually expressed itself as a kind of small-scale guardianship of her wherever she went, following her through the cabin with his arms partly extended as though he expected her to fall at any moment, which, given Ruth's early ambitions toward vertical mobility, was not an unreasonable precaution. Through the early 1880s, the life on the Western Ridge had the full layered quality of a family that has found its correct shape. The cabin had been extended. Eli had added 2 rooms over a summer, with Thomas's earnest and not entirely efficient assistance, and the kitchen had been enlarged to accommodate the reality of serious cooking, which Clara had insisted upon, and Eli had built to her specifications with the same careful attention he gave to everything. The orchard was in its prime. The 24 surviving trees were now mature, full canopied, and in a good year produced a harvest that kept the family in apple products through the winter and still left plenty for the town below. Clara had developed the operation methodically over the years. She dried apple slices in summer and kept them in cloth bags in the cool of the root cellar, put up apple butter in early autumn in the large crockery jars, pressed some of the crop for a tart juice that she and Eli both preferred to water on the long winter evenings. The pie had become a kind of ceremony. She made it at least once a week through the harvest season, and her children had grown up with the smell of it as one of the fundamental facts of home, the way some children grow up with the sea or with prairie wind or with the particular sound of a city street. Thomas and Ruth both knew the recipe by heart before they were old enough to execute it well, and they had both, at various points in their childhoods, presented their parents with apple pies of variable quality, and watched anxiously while their parents tasted them with expressions of serious consideration. Eli always said, of every pie, regardless of quality, that it was very good, which Clara felt was both loving and slightly pedagogically unsound. She generally followed his assessment with a more specific analysis, delivered kindly, which she felt balanced the instruction adequately. Eli had continued his trapping and hunting, though the nature of it had shifted over the years as the territory changed around them. The fur trade that had brought so many men west was thinner than it had been. The markets in the east had changed, and the land was more settled, and the long solitary seasons he had once spent in the high country were not the same as they had been. He had moved over the years toward a different kind of economy, guiding, for parties of men who came west to hunt and needed someone who knew the mountains, occasional work as a surveyor's assistant for the land office, for which his precise knowledge of the high country was valuable, and the orchard itself, which in its productive years was a meaningful contribution to the household. He was also, quietly, the person that Coldwater Creek called when something went wrong in the high country. When a miner went missing above the tree line in a late October storm in 1880, it was Eli who went up into the whitening weather and came back 2 days later with the man alive, frostbitten on 2 fingers and deeply chastened. When a family's milk cow wandered into the canyon above the East Trail in the spring of 1881, it was Eli who found her and got her out, which required a combination of physical strength and bovine psychology that he described to Clara afterward with a dry precision that made her laugh until she had to sit down. He was the kind of man that a community needs, steady, capable, not requiring recognition for what he provided, but providing it with consistency over years and decades in the way that makes a place worth living in. Clara understood this about him and said so, directly, which was the way she said most things. "You know," she told him once, on a winter evening when the snow was coming down heavily outside and the fire was well built and Thomas was doing his lessons at the table and Ruth was asleep in the next room, that this town would be significantly worse off without you. Eli had looked up from the harness he was mending and considered this. "I could say the same about you," he said. "I know, but I'm saying it about you." He had held her gaze for a moment with that steady attention. "I like it here," he said. "I like the life we have." He paused. "I've not always, in my life, I've not always had a good reason to stay in one place. And now you do. And now I do. Several of them." She had crossed the room and sat next to him at the table, close enough that their arms touched, and they had been quiet together for a while, which was one of the things she loved most about their marriage. The quality of the silence they had built, the way they could be in the same room and not speaking and have the room be full rather than empty. One January evening in 1882, a stranger arrived in Coldwater Creek on a horse that had been ridden too hard in the cold, and he carried letters for 3 people in the town. Clara's letter was from a lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, informing her that the last of her father's land in the Shenandoah Valley had finally been sold and that there was a sum of money waiting for her, not enormous, but not nothing, the last trace of what had been her family's life in the East. She had held the letter for a long time that night, after the children were asleep, sitting by the fire while Eli read. He had watched her without asking, in his way, and when she finally looked up, she had said, "It feels like the last door closing on something." "Is that hard?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, as she always tried to. "A little," she said. "And also, no. No, I think I closed it myself a long time ago. This is just the legal part catching up." "Virginia," Eli said. He said it simply, not with judgment or invitation. "I have not missed it in years," Clara said, "except the apple trees." She paused and a small smile moved across her face. "But you took care of that." Eli looked at her over his book. The firelight was good on his face, the strong jaw and the gray eyes and the temples now fully silver, the long familiar face that she had been looking at for a decade and still found new in it sometimes. "I did," he said. She put the letter away and went back to her sewing, and the evening continued, and she thought that this quiet and this fire and this man across from her and the sound of her children breathing in the next room and the apple trees standing in the snow outside, patient and permanent, was the closed door she had been looking for when she got on that freight wagon in Virginia in 1872. Not an ending at all, but the thing you found when you stopped looking. In the spring of 1883, Klaus Brauer from Ridgeway came to visit. He was an old man now, white-haired and slow-moving, but sharp-eyed and pleased, and he walked through the orchard with Eli and Clara and ran his weathered hands over the bark of the Roxbury russets with an expression of such frank satisfaction that Clara felt a rush of gratitude toward him that she expressed directly. "These trees," she said, "have given us more than I can tell you." Klaus had looked at her with a twinkle in his eye. "The trees are just trees," he said. "The man who planted them is the thing." Eli had been looking at the far end of the orchard with his back to them, and Clara thought she saw his shoulders move with a brief, suppressed reaction to this. She caught Klaus's eye, and the old man gave her a small, satisfied nod. They ate well that visit. Clara made 3 pies over the 2 days he stayed, the first time she had made them in genuine abundance since the previous autumn, and Klaus ate 2 full slices at each meal with the methodical appreciation of a man who recognized good work when he encountered it. "Your grandmother," he said after the second pie. "She was a good cook." "She was the best I ever knew," Clara said. "She used to say that a good pie was an act of love." "She was right," Klaus said, with the certainty of a man who had grown apple trees at altitude because he believed fruit was worth the trouble. Thomas was 7 in 1883, and Ruth was 4, and the two of them had the orchard as their kingdom. Clara had watched over the years as her children moved through those apple rows with a familiarity she found profoundly satisfying, not just because she had wanted them to know the trees, but because she saw in their easy comfort among the growing things a kind of rootedness she had never had as a child and had always wanted for her own children. Thomas had a serious relationship with the orchard that was very like his father's relationship with the mountains, respectful, attentive, knowing. He could tell you by late summer which trees were going to have a good year and which were struggling, could identify the early symptoms of apple scab and fire blight, had opinions about pruning technique that he expressed with a thoroughness that his schoolteacher in town, the new Mr. Driscoll, who had replaced old Mr. Aldrich, found both admirable and slightly unnerving. Ruth's relationship with the orchard was more physical and immediate. She climbed the trees. She ate apples directly off the branch with a directness that Clara had tried half-heartedly to modify and eventually abandoned because some battles were not worth the energy. She dragged her dolls out to the orchard and arranged them under the trees in configurations whose meaning only she fully understood. And she talked to the trees in the same continuous murmur her father used when he was working, which Clara thought was the most specifically Vance family thing she had ever witnessed. Through the summer of 1884, a difficult season came to the territory. There had been a drought in the lower valleys, and the heat had been worse than anyone in Coldwater Creek could remember, and the creek itself had run lower than it ever had in the memory of the oldest residents. The crops in the valley farms had suffered. Several families had had a genuinely hard year, and the mood in town through the autumn was worried in the way that agricultural people get worried, not dramatically, but with a deep and patient anxiety born of understanding that the land does not always provide. The Vance orchard, high on the ridge where the moisture from the mountain snowmelt still reached, had fared better than the valley crops. The trees were well established now, their roots going deep, and while the yield was reduced from the previous year's abundance, it was still meaningful. Clara had brought larger quantities than usual down to the town that autumn, and had given much of it away outright to the families who had been hardest hit, and had organized a community apple pressing day at Harold's livery stable that produced enough apple juice to make a significant dent in the season's bleakness. Harold had been slower than usual that year. He was an old man now, Clara realized with a small private shock one October afternoon that her uncle was past 70, which was old for a man in this territory and this time. He still ran the livery stable, with increasing help from a young man named Felix, who had come to the town from New Mexico, but there were days when Clara could see the weight of his years on him plainly. She spent more time in town that autumn and winter than she had in some years, riding down frequently to check on him, bringing food and company and sometimes just sitting with him by his stove in the evenings and talking. Harold died in January of 1885, quietly in his sleep, in the room above the livery stable where he had lived since he came to Coldwater Creek. He was 72 years old, and he had had a full life and a good death, and the town mourned him with the particular warmth reserved for people who had been genuinely useful to a community over a long time. Clara had wept, and then had been all right, and then had wept again, and Eli had held her through all the stages of it without trying to fix any of them, which was exactly right. She had gone through the livery with Felix and the town lawyer and handled everything in the practical, decisive way she handled all things. And the outcome was that Harold left the livery stable to Felix, who had earned it, and left Clara a few personal items, his old pocket watch, a photograph she had not known existed of her father as a young man, and the rocking chair from his room that had come west with him all the way from Virginia. She had cried again over the photograph. She had sat in the rocking chair on the cabin porch for a whole summer evening, and rocked slowly, and watched the light leave the mountains, and felt the long, unbroken line of the people who had made her, grandmother and mother and father and Uncle Harold, and had thanked them privately for the recipe book and the stubbornness and the ability to love and the willingness to pack everything into 2 trunks and get on a freight wagon into the unknown. Without any of that, she would never have ended up on this mountain, in this chair, with this view, with those trees in the meadow below and those children in the cabin behind her and that man. She could hear him inside now, his low voice explaining something to Thomas about the principles of water flow, making her world what it was. Thomas was 9 years old. Ruth was 6. The cabin had a braided rug on the floor and curtains in the windows and a grandmother's recipe book on the shelf and 2 children's worth of accumulated childhood artifacts in every corner. The orchard below the cabin was 12 years old, full-grown and producing, a permanent feature of the high ridge that would outlast all of them. Through the latter years of the 1880s, the territory itself was changing. Colorado had been a state since 1876, and the growth that statehood brought was visible even in a small valley like Coldwater Creek's. More people coming through, new buildings going up on the main street, a proper hotel replacing the 2 rooms that the saloon owner had previously rented out above the bar. The railroad had reached a junction 20 miles south, which meant that goods came more readily now, and that the long isolation of mountain towns like this one was slowly, permanently altering. Ptolemy Graves had expanded his store twice and finally surrendered his magnificent mustache in a moment of grooming enthusiasm he had regretted ever since. The church steeple had been straightened and reinforced. The schoolhouse had been given a second room and a second teacher. Coldwater Creek was growing up, as the West was growing up, and Clara watched it happen with the mixed feeling of someone who had arrived when it was small and scrappy and loved it for that, but who also understood that growth was not an enemy. She was 38 in 1888. She did not feel 38 in the way that she had imagined 38 from the vantage of 22. She felt active and strong and curious, which was how the mountain life kept you. It had no patience for sedentary decline, and it did not offer it. She still rode Patience, a different Patience now, Patience being a name she'd carried over to successive horses, which was a habit Eli found amusing, down the mountain for her teaching, which she still did twice a week and had no intention of stopping. She was 40 in 1890, and Eli was 57, and they had settled into a middle-aged ease that she thought was one of the best things about a long marriage, the knowledge of each other that had depth to it, that had been tested by hard winters and grief and the practical difficulties of living a real life. There was nothing they had not moved through together now. There was nothing she could not say to him and nothing she did not want to. He was still enormous. Time had softened none of that. He moved a little more carefully now on icy trails, and there were mornings when she could see the old shoulder injury he had sustained in a fall in 1881, reminding him of itself. But he was still the strongest person she knew, and still carried that particular quality of contained certainty that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Thomas had gone down to Denver for schooling in 1888, at 15, which had cost Clara several weeks of quiet anguish that she had managed with the practical efficiency she brought to everything that was painful and unavoidable. He was a serious and precise young man, interested in both agriculture and law, which combination Eli had observed was probably going to make him either very useful to the world or very tiresome, possibly both. He had written letters home with the regularity and detail of a dutiful son, and he'd come back to the ridge for every harvest season because the orchard pulled him back as clearly as it pulled everyone who had grown up in it. Ruth, at 11, was a force of nature. She was already taller than most girls her age, with her father's build and her mother's directness, and she had an intellectual ferocity that had long since exhausted Mr. Driscoll at the schoolhouse and was currently working through a stack of books her brother had sent from Denver with a speed that Clara found both impressive and slightly vertiginous to watch. She wanted to know everything about everything, with a particular interest in botany and in the law, the latter interest sparked by Thomas's letters describing his studies. Clara had taught her to make the pie when she was 7, and Ruth had mastered it by 8 with the same methodical intensity she applied to everything, and now, at 11, made it better than any version Clara had produced in the early years of her marriage, which Clara acknowledged freely and without any particular resentment, because it seemed right that the knowledge should improve with each transmission. In the autumn of 1891, Thomas came home from Denver having finished his studies, and he came home with a young woman named Hannah Sorensen, who was a teacher's daughter from a Swedish family in the city, composed and clear-eyed, with a practical intelligence that Clara liked immediately and a willingness to carry her own weight in any circumstance that Eli liked equally immediately. The young couple sat on the extended porch of the Vance cabin on a September evening, with the orchard gold and red below them and the sky turning colors over the mountains, and Thomas told his parents that he intended to come home to Coldwater Creek to study law there and eventually practice it, and that he hoped Hannah would agree to marry him. Hannah, who had been listening to this announcement with a small smile, said that she had already agreed, which Thomas acknowledged with the slightly flustered expression of a young man who has been outpaced by a more organized mind. And Clara had looked at Eli and thought that their son had found someone very similar to his mother, which she meant as a compliment to both parties. They were married the following spring, in 1892, in the same leaning steepled church where Clara and Eli had married 18 years before, the steeple now straight and the church expanded, and Clara sat in the front pew with Eli's arm around her and watched her son marry and felt the full closed circle of it. Ruth was 12 and served as a kind of junior attendant at the wedding with an expression of dignified tolerance for the ceremonial aspects and barely concealed excitement about the party afterward, at which there was dancing that she participated in with enthusiasm and skill, having taught herself to dance from a book because she had determined it was a useful social skill and was not prepared to lack it. In 1893, Thomas and Hannah had their first child, a boy born in the early summer, and they named him Harold Eli Vance after the two old men who mattered most. And Clara had gone down from the ridge to be with Hannah through the labor, and had held her first grandchild in her arms in the small house Thomas had built on the edge of Coldwater Creek, and felt the world extend outward in all directions. Eli, when he held Harold Eli, was utterly quiet for a very long time. "He looks like Thomas," Clara said. "He looks like Thomas looked," Eli said, which was different, meaning the Thomas of 20 years ago, the serious small boy who had named the apple trees. He looked up from the baby. "Are you all right?" "I am extraordinary," Clara said, which was the truth. Ruth, by the mid-1890s, was in full brilliant flight. She had gone to a school for girls in Colorado Springs at 16, the best in the state, and had written letters home that grew longer and denser with each passing month, covering topics from botany to legal theory to the suffrage movement, which was gaining real momentum in Colorado. The state had given women the vote in 1893, one of the first in the country to do so, and Ruth had come home for Christmas of that year incandescent about it, and had delivered a speech at the dinner table that lasted 40 minutes and covered the full historical context with the thoroughness of a woman who had been preparing arguments since she learned to talk. Eli had listened to the whole 40 minutes. He had asked 2 specific questions at the end, both of which cut directly to the points she had least thoroughly argued, which made her sit up straighter and rethink them out loud. Clara, watching this exchange between her daughter and her husband, had thought that this was one of the things she was proudest of in their life together. The way he took Ruth entirely seriously, had always taken her entirely seriously, treated her intelligence as a fact and her opinions as worth engaging with. Ruth studied law. She was one of a very small number of women in Colorado Territory and then Colorado State to do so in that era, and she did it with the same determined precision she brought to apple pie and botany and dancing, and she was very good at it. Clara turned 50 in 1900. The new century arrived with the quality of a door opening, and she stood on the porch of the cabin on the first morning of January 1900 and breathed the cold air and looked at the orchard below her. The trees grown thick and full, their winter branches dark against the snow, the oldest of them now 26 years from the year Eli had planted them in the spring of 1874, and thought about time. 26 years. Thomas was 24 and a practicing attorney in Coldwater Creek, husband to Hannah, father to young Harold, who was now 6, and to a daughter born in 1896 named Clara, which had made her grandmother sit down rather suddenly and press both hands to her face. Ruth was 20 and in her second year of law school. Eli was 67 and still on this mountain, still the finest shot in the territory, still carrying firewood as if it were made of air. She was 50 years old, and she had the grandchildren and the children and the husband and the orchard and the mountain and the grandmother's recipe book on the shelf and the cast-iron skillet that had come west with her in 1872 and was still in use every day. She had her teaching, though she taught only 2 mornings a week now, the schoolhouse having grown into something requiring full-time professional staff. She had her pies and her mornings and her long evenings with Eli by the fire. She went inside and made coffee, and when Eli came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, she handed him a cup and kissed him and said, "Happy New Century." "Happy New Century," he said, and drank the coffee, and the morning continued. In the spring of 1900, Ruth came home for the apple blossoms, as she did every year when she could manage it, and sat with her parents in the orchard on a warm April afternoon, with the blossom so dense and fragrant that the air felt thick with it, and told them she had met a man in Denver, a colleague named James Holt, who was a decent lawyer, and more importantly, could make her laugh and was not intimidated by her, which she said was a shorter list than it should have been. Clara had looked at her daughter, sitting in the grass between the apple trees, 20 years old and fully herself, sharp-minded and sure, and still with something of the small girl who had named her dolls under these branches and had felt nothing but uncomplicated joy. "Tell me about him," she said. Ruth told her. She talked for an hour without stopping, which was both surprising and not at all surprising, and Clara listened with the full attention she had given to every important thing Ruth had ever said, and by the end she had a clear enough picture to say, with some confidence, "Bring him to the ridge in the fall." "He does not know anything about apple trees," Ruth said. "He will learn," Eli said simply. Ruth laughed. "You would say that?" "I have said it before," Eli said. "About your mother." Clara looked at him. He met her eyes across the apple-blossomed orchard, and they were 67 and 50, and they had been married 26 years, and she still felt in his look the same directness and weight and warmth she had felt in the first moments she had truly seen him, and she thought that this was what love actually was, the real thing behind all the stories about it, not the beginning of it, but this, the middle and the depth and the permanence, the person who had heard you say you missed something and spent a year making it for you, the person who was still there, gray-haired and steady across a quarter-century of seasons. James Holt came to the ridge that autumn. He was a lean, fair-haired young man with good manners and an immediate and genuine interest in everything. And he walked through the orchard with Ruth and listened to everything she told him about it with an attention that Clara, watching from the porch, thought boded very well for his future as a husband to her daughter. He ate the apple pie Clara made on his first evening without ceremony or performance, and he said, after his first bite, that he had never had anything like it, and Ruth said of course he hadn't, and the two of them looked at each other in the way of people who share their own private world, and Clara had leaned against Eli's arm on the porch and thought that things were continuing as they should. Ruth and James were married in 1901. They settled in Denver, where both of them practiced law, and they came to the ridge for every harvest season and for Christmas when the weather allowed, and the orchard was always part of those visits, the smell of it, the weight of the apples in the hand, the pie on the table. Eli and Clara were alone again on the ridge, and it was different from their first aloneness, richer, more known, rooted in everything they had lived together. There were mornings through the early years of the new century when Eli would go down to the orchard before Clara was up, and she would find him there when she came out, standing among the trees with his coffee, not doing anything in particular, just present with them the way he was present with the mountains. He had built those trees with his hands, had carried water to them and staked them against wind, and watched them grow from whips to their full height over 2.5 decades. And they had the quality, for him, of something he had raised, not owned, but cared for, which was different and better. She would bring him a second cup of coffee and they would walk the rows together, checking for signs of disease or damage, noting which trees would have heavy fruit this year and which were in a resting cycle. They talked about the trees the way they talked about the children, with knowledge and affection, and the long memory of people who have watched something grow. In the autumn of 1905, the Roxbury russet at the north end of the second row, the oldest and most gnarled of the trees, the one Thomas had named Augustus when he was 5, and the name had stuck, went into a final decline. Eli had seen it coming through the summer, the reduced vigor, the fewer leaves, the way a very old tree begins to release its energy back into the earth. They took the last apples from Augustus in September, carefully, and Clara made 2 pies from them that she served at the October gathering she held each year for the town. The tree came down in a November wind, and Eli spent a day with it the following morning. clearing the fallen wood, preserving what could be seasoned for the fire, and planting a new sapling in the prepared earth beside it, a young Roxbury russet that would take years to reach the size Augustus had been, but that would be there, bearing fruit, long after all of them. Clara had watched him plant it from the porch, a 67-year-old man on his knees in the October cold, working the earth around the roots of a tree he would probably never see in its full maturity. And she had felt the tears come before she had decided to cry, as they sometimes still did, not from sadness, but from the sheer quality of what was being given. She went down and sat beside him in the turned earth while he worked, and he glanced at her and saw her face and understood. And he did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and he had always known when silence was the right language. When the tree was planted and staked, he sat back on his heels and looked at it, small in the autumn ground, a beginning. "It will be here," he said, "for Thomas's children and Ruth's and theirs." "Everything you plant survives," Clara said. He looked at her steadily, and she knew he understood that she meant more than the trees. And he put one big arm around her, and they sat in the orchard together for a while longer, in the cold and the still October light, with the remaining trees around them, full and rooted and permanent. In 1907, Ruth had her first child, a boy, and named him Eli James Holt. And when Clara wrote to tell Ruth what she felt about the name, she could not finish the letter in one sitting because she kept having to stop and collect herself. The old Eli, upon receiving this information by way of Thomas, who had heard from Hannah, who had received a letter from Ruth, had been so quiet for so long that Clara had finally asked him directly how he felt about it. "Good," he had said, and the way he said it held more meaning than the word. She had put both arms around him from behind, which required some reaching given the difference in their heights, and he had put his hands over hers, and they had stood like that in the kitchen for a long, warm, sufficient minute. Thomas and Hannah had added 2 more children by this point, a second son, Thomas Whitmore Vance, Jr., born in 1898, and a daughter, Eleanor, born in 1901. The cabin that Eli had built alone in the 1860s on the western ridge had become the gravitational center of a large and expanding family, and the autumn harvests had become extended gatherings, children running between the apple trees, Hannah helping Clara in the kitchen while the smell of pie filled the enlarged cabin, Eli and Thomas and James Holt walking the orchard rows in discussion, the sound of multiple generations of voices filling the mountain air. On the last evening of October 1908, Clara made the apple pie. She made it as she always did. The cold crust, the thinly sliced apples, the precise sugar and cinnamon, the egg wash, the coarse sugar pressed into the lattice top. The kitchen was warm and full of the smell of it, and Eli was at the table reading, as he so often was, and the fire was good. And outside, the October cold was pressing against the window glass. She took the pie from the fire and set it on the table to cool, and she sat down across from him with her own cup of coffee, and the smell of the pie spread through the room the way it always did, carrying everything with it, her grandmother and the Virginia orchard, and the first smell of blossom on the ridge in April 1874, and the look on Eli's face when she had seen the trees for the first time, and the whole long accumulation of seasons. "Do you remember," she said, "when I told you I missed apple pie?" He looked up from his book. "I remember," he said. "You were in Harold's parlor. The door was open. You heard me, and you spent 6 months digging up a mountainside." "It was not quite 6 months," he said, with that slight precision she had always found endearing and occasionally maddening. "Eli." "All right. It was approximately 6 months." She looked at him across the table, her husband, the man who had heard one sentence from a grieving young woman and turned it into 24 living apple trees and 34 years of marriage and 2 children and 4 grandchildren and more pies than she could count. The man with the gray eyes and the strong, careful hands and the dark hair gone fully silver now, who had walked into her life and knelt in the cold earth of a Colorado mountainside and grown her something to come home to. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He put the book down. He looked at her with that direct, unhurried look that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, that quality of full attention, of being entirely present. "Clara," he said, and in the way he said it was everything. The September evening on Harold's porch where they had first kissed, and the spring morning she had seen the blossoms, and the night Thomas was born, and the rocking chair on the porch after Harold died, and every ordinary morning between. "I would have done more," he said, "if you had mentioned it earlier." She laughed, the free, unguarded laugh that this man had always been able to produce from her without trying, and she reached across the table and took his hand, the big, roughened, capable hand, and he turned it and closed his fingers around hers. Outside, the apple trees stood in the October dark, bare of leaves now, their branches patient and skeletal against the mountain sky, waiting for spring as they always waited, as they would always wait, planted by a man who loved a woman who loved her grandmother's pie, rooted deep in the mountain earth, bearing fruit season after season, outlasting and sustaining and growing in the way that all the best things grow, slowly, steadily, and with a love behind them that had no need to declare itself, because the whole orchard already said it, clear as any language, every time the blossoms opened. The fire burned down and built back up, and the coffee cooled, and the pie sat fragrant and golden on the table between them, and neither of them moved to cut it for a while, because the moment was full enough on its own, complete in the way that 34 years of mornings and seasons and harvests and shared silences had made them, complete in the way of things that have found their final permanent shape, like an old tree with its roots going all the way down to the bedrock of the world. Clara cut the pie eventually, as she always did, with the same cast-iron knife she had used since Virginia, and she laid a piece in front of Eli and watched him take the first bite, as she had watched him take the first bite of every pie made from these trees for 32 years, and his expression was what it had always been. Quiet satisfaction, genuine pleasure, and beneath it the thing she always saw, and that always undid her slightly. Gratitude, not for the pie itself, but for the fact that she was still here, making it in this kitchen, in this life, on this mountain, his. "It is good," he said. "Of course it is," she told him. And it was. It was, and it always would be. And outside the orchard waited in the cold for spring, and the mountains held the valley in their ancient arms, and Coldwater Creek burned with its small, warm lights in the dark below, and the whole world was exactly what it should be. Not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but full and rooted and real, made of the same things all good lives are made of. Work and attention and patience, and the courage to plant something you believe in, even alone, even in the cold, even when the harvest is years away.